Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, it is the 6th of April, 2022. Uh, it just fucks with my mind continuously how fast time moves. I mean, even when you're in the moment of it, it's slow, but or relatively slow. But I blink, and yeah. The last time I lived in Hawaii, the last time I visited there, it's been like 20 years. It's I just can't get over it. I want to say it's crazy, and I'll tell you, I this is gonna actually connect to what I want to talk about, but I want to say it's crazy, and I don't want to use ableist language. And I don't know, I'm very I'm a little bit all over the map on this one. And obviously, everything that I talk about today, just to be clear, I am not by any means an expert on. Way outside of my domain of expertise. Everything I'm going to say is literally just my opinion or passing thoughts. And it's also, even if some of it sounds strongly held, it's pretty weakly held. I mean, with compelling evidence or arguments, I could be nudged one way or another here. But in terms of like, ableism is an interesting thing. I there are certain things that I would definitely not say, like the R word. No, it's just I can't even remember using that as a kid, and certainly as an adult, just out of my vocabulary. It's banished. And then there's a range. There are some words like insane. And I go back and forth on this one because for a long time I just wouldn't say it. And the thing that's frustrating is there are a lot of things where I want to say something is just like something is crazy, something is insane. And to be clear, I don't mean to disparage people who are mentally ill. B, and I'm always very careful about this, when I say something like that, I'm saying the thing or something that somebody is doing, not the person, which may be a trivial distinction to a lot of people, but to me means a lot. Uh, I generally speaking, and I've said this many times, but generally speaking, I won't call a person stupid. I'll say that what they're doing is stupid. And, I wouldn't call somebody mentally ill other than maybe Trump, who I think, again, way out of my domain of expertise, pretty sure he's a malignant narcissist at least. Not that I'm in any kind of position to form a diagnosis there. Even if I was an expert in that, well, first off, if I was an expert, I would probably know enough not to say something like that. And second, if I was an expert, I've not treated him. I have not, I'm just going by his public persona, and who knows what that means. It could be an act. It could be a particular aspect of his personality that doesn't fully encompass who he is. But, yeah, given the propensity or given I've lost the word. This is a thing that's killing me. I don't know if this is any worse than it used to be, but it's definitely bothering me more. I'm more aware of it. Just at a loss of words sometimes. And what I'm trying to say is the propensity of evidence, but that's not even the right word. It's not there. It's just killing me. The sum of evidence that we have, say that, it's gonna bother me. Anyway, I'm not even gonna get further into that because it's a silly thing to talk about. But back to this ableist language thing. Insane, I want to use because there are so many times where something is just the thing that somebody's doing or the thing that is happening or the thing that is in the news is just so outside of reasonable bounds. That I want to say that that thing is something which captures that. And I've looked at other words to use in that context, and it's really one of these cases where, kind of like fuck. I There are lots of words that you can use in lots of contexts, and yet I've never found one, and I don't think this is for lack of having fairly decent vocabulary. It's just I've never found a word that captures fuck, or a lot of shit, piss, a lot of these other words, but fuck especially. I mean, it fits every part of speech. We studied it in one of my linguistics classes as an undergrad, which I'm not nostalgic per se for any period of my life, but one of my favorite periods, especially in my university, post-high school education, or post-secondary, I guess they call it, is undergrad. And it's not that, like, graduate school had a lot of nice things about it, but in graduate school, you're so focused on whatever your domain subject is, you don't really get outside of it that much. My advisor, when I was doing my PhD, wasn't too excited about me even taking a course in field theory. And I got a PhD in physics, and taking a physics course outside of that domain that I was focused on wasn't too cool for him. And taking other courses, which I did that were way outside of that, not really hyper kosher for him. Yeah. But as an undergrad, you could take so many different courses. I mean, first off, every semester I'd take 5 or 6 courses. And of those courses, I would get a nice variety. And it would be in so many different fields. And one of those fields a couple of times was linguistics. I took philosophy of science. That one made a really big and lasting impact. There are so many things that I studied that I've used probably. I really don't feel like anything that I learned was useless or has not informed me in pretty much everything that I've done since. I always find it. I find it odd when people say, like, oh, calculus is so worthless or something like this. Calculus is extremely useful. And frankly, calculus is extremely useful pretty much no matter what you do. And I know you can hear people bitching about it, like, oh, no, Scott, calculus is not. The problem, I think, is that you were probably not taught calculus well. Probably had a bad professor teaching it. Yeah, and you weren't really, I don't know how to say this. There's learning something in sort of the rote memorization, and then there's learning it in the way that you kind of own it, like it becomes a part of you. It's just like an extra, not even just a tool, but almost an extra appendage that you can use. And for me, calculus is like this. I'll come up against a problem, and to be fair, a lot of my problems end up being like engineering problems, because that's a lot of what I do. But I come up with stuff that just uses calculus or differential equations, stochastic differential equations, all the time. And it's one of those things, like, if I didn't ever study stochastic differential equations, I wouldn't even know how to approach some of these problems. And once you have that tool, it's so useful. And, so you're like, okay, I'm not an engineer, I'm just a whatever. Well, you can use calculus for optimization problems. You can use it for, I mean, just calculating volumes of things is pretty cool, but optimization ends up being very useful for probably anything, I would say. But moving aside from that, I really find every course that I took to be useful. Even the courses where the professor was not great, even some of the courses that I found, like more esoteric and kind of dragged on. Trying to think of an example of that. I had a couple courses. I think the worst one that I had, and I don't really want to pick on the professor that taught it, though I think at this point, unless someone looks at my transcript, you're going to have trouble finding who this professor is. And he's retired now, so I'm pretty sure he's retired. But it was my optics course. As a student, I pretty much always, there were classes in, especially high school and before, where I had to study history or something like that, which I now regret not putting more time and effort into. And I didn't do very much of the reading, or I would have had to memorize dates and names. Names don't stick for some reason with me. Sternocleidomastoid muscle, I learned in high school. I heard it one time, and it's just in there. My memory is not as good as it once was, incidentally, or at least I don't think so. Today I took my written exam for FAA IFR rating, and I passed. You can pass at a 70%. I got something in the 80s, and it was okay, but also kind of disappointing. Like, I don't know, I did a lot of, I actually studied for it, which I normally wouldn't have to do. And I was doing pretty well on the practice exams. I was getting into the 90s. And so I was expecting to do well. And there were just some questions there where I was like, shit, I remember this and just have no fucking clue what the answer was. Just these little specific things like, in this case, is it 1,000 feet or is it 1,500 feet? And I could narrow it down to 2, so it was like a coin toss, but couldn't remember which one. Obviously, tests are kind of a learning tool, so in that sense, I will study those things that I was weak on, and then I'll walk away knowing them. But I still would have rather just taken the test and, maybe not get 100%, but you get decent. Was disappointing. But in my domain, one of the areas that I'm an expert in, and also in one that in high school I took physics, and part of that physics was geometric optics. And I did really well in that. I did, that was actually a great teacher and a subject that I liked. But the teacher, I had so many good science teachers. It's so sad how much education is undervalued, and especially I went to a public school. I had an amazing biology teacher. I had an amazing physics teacher. Had some really good math teachers. Pretty good humanities teacher, and chemistry was okay. Yeah, a lot of teachers that left an impact, and I don't even know if they would be teachers today because they get underpaid so much. And in the 90s, there was one of these fucking stupid, I have mixed feelings about direct democracy, honestly. But one of these petitions, ballot initiatives that we had, set this policy up where all it would take is a simple majority of the state legislature to decrease spending or decrease taxation. But if you wanted to increase it, then you need a 2/3 supermajority. And predictably, you can barely, right now I think it's like one person shy of a Democratic majority in both houses. And it's just getting that is like a massive work and effort. And the Republicans are not, despite being ostensibly conservative, they're not and fiscally responsible, they claim, but clearly not. They won't make investments in education, which reliably, and it's crazy when you see this. There's my ableist language again. But you see, I don't feel like that's a bad usage of that word. I really don't. I understand why people are sensitive to it, but I feel like some things are just kind of okay, and maybe I'm just a relic of the past there, but I don't feel like it. I feel like people have pushed this one a little bit too far. But I don't know. Again, weakly held kind of belief there. But I just find it so useful, and I can't think of a word that fits that meaning that feels the same. You know, like going back to linguistics was one of my undergrad courses. We learned fuck, studied fuck. That it's every part of speech, that it's even an infix, which English doesn't have otherwise. And it's also something like, it's this short staccato thing that carries a lot more intensity, and can be used in so many different ways too, that I just don't think there's another word that comes close. You know, you can kind of make up for it with a larger vocabulary, but you're not going to get exactly that angle, you know? You're taking a tool out of your belt. There are certain words where I don't feel like, you know, the F word. I never need to say it. Just never need to say it. The N word. I just zero use for me. It's not a word for me. These are words that other people can say, although I'm ambivalent about that even, but for me, I just don't feel like it's my place to use either of these words, and I don't feel like I'm losing anything for them. I don't really have, like, there's nothing that, I don't have the compulsion to say either one of them. Even when there's like a song with the N word in it, I don't even have the desire or the impulse to say it. I just, like, my impulse is just to like shut the fuck up when that word comes. But crazy, you know, I don't feel the same way about. The C word. Now this is an interesting one because obviously, like in the UK or former colonies, I guess the extended kingdom, I'm trying to say Australia, but you know, it's something that just means like a chum or a friend, or, you know, it's not really a strong word, but when I was in graduate school, I'm sure I've talked about this before, but my next door neighbor, one of the next door neighbors, had a friend over, and she was a pretty like strong feminist. And I was telling this story about something, I didn't say it, I was just recounting what my roommate said, and it had the C word in it. And my neighbor's friend was very, very bothered by this. I know not everybody is. I know a lot of people kind of don't care about it, but her reaction to it, and I know also like there are people who have that kind of reaction to fuck. I don't know why. I'm kind of stubborn, I guess. People have that reaction to fuck. I don't feel like I have any grounds for it really. Especially, I mean, I'm not even going to get too much into the detail there, but I just don't, does not move me. But the C word has a lot of charge to it, especially in US language. So when she was this bothered by it, it really left an impression and pretty much voided from my vocabulary. I will say it occasionally under very specific circumstances, but even then, yeah, I've probably, in the time since then, which has been a couple decades now, I've probably said it a handful of times and never with any kind of conviction. It was more just in a context where it kind of felt appropriate-ish. And even then, it was, yeah, iffy. But it's interesting, like crazy. I know some people are bothered by it, and I would never call a person that, other than saying like what they're doing is crazy, or they're acting crazy maybe is, yeah. But, and even that I probably would shy away from. I just have trouble really feeling that one. And insane also, and you know, my therapist, I talked with her about this stuff, and she uses these words as well. which, she's somebody who has a PhD in the subject, feels okay with using this stuff, and she's also like pretty lefty, like kind of aligned with me politically, and she's okay with it. I feel like I was reserved on using it, and then she said that, and I'm kind of like, yeah, between that and the way it feels, like there's just not a word that has that same, there's not it's a spice, and you just don't have that spice if you take fuck or crazy out of your vocabulary. And it's a spice that's useful. It's not like some horrible spice that it's not like, I'm trying to think of one that I don't like. I'm not a huge fan of nutmeg. I know people like it. Nutmeg and cinnamon, I could never have the rest of my life and would not really mind. There are things where they're okay, but they're just not my favorite spices. They're things that kind of, and the pumpkin spice, I mean, whatever the fuck that shit is, which I think actually includes those too. I find that nauseating. Honestly, I find it repulsive. And it's a spice that I don't need. Maybe that's the N word. But, yeah. I guess the F, weird. I guess fuck would be kind of like, I don't know if it would be salt, but salt or some kind of like hot pepper or something that I find it useful, and I don't think there's a good substitute for it. So anyway, going back to the undergrad stuff, and this will kind of get into what I wanted to talk about. One of those courses I took as an undergrad was a women's studies course. Now it would be gender studies. It's funny how much things have changed. A lot of things are kind of similar, but there are a lot of things that change in time. And I think it's a good thing overall, generally speaking. Not 100%, because, there are things that are regressions, but this is one that I think is a pretty good one. But in this course that I took, I can't remember what the title was or what the numbers were, but whatever it was kind of like a overview of a lot of topics. It was probably like, if it was called gender studies, what I took, it would have been probably more appropriate anyway. But one of the things that we touched on was the word gender. And up until this point, I was always bothered by people substituting out. This is actually a thing that I've changed my mind a few times on. But up until this point, people would sub out gender for sex, or sex for gender, rather. So like you could tell they didn't want to say the word sex, probably because they had some kind of weird religious hang up about it. And so they'd put the word gender in, and I didn't really know the definition, but it was obvious that it was inappropriate and wasn't really what they meant. So like, what is the sex on a test? And then they would change that to gender. And it's interesting because I've kind of come full circle on this now, because sex in the sense of biological sex, maybe that's not that meaningful of a concept. It is, I mean, I guess in certain specific domains, but when you're talking about people, not as much. But at the time, didn't think about that so much. So at the time, I was learning this, and it was very eye-opening, because it was just like gender is I don't have a great denotation of it, but basically sex was more this biological thing, and then gender is more how you present and how you identify. It's more of like a social layer to it. And so, which is another thing that's kind of weird, because now they have these gender reveal parties which regularly kill people, and you have no idea what the gender of your baby is unless you have a time machine. So at the point that they have these things, they really mean probably a sex reveal party, which sounds pretty fucking weird. And even when you don't use the word sex, it's pretty fucking weird. So I think it's appropriately weird that, It's just fucking bizarre. We need to blow up dynamite or something to tell people that you're having a boy. It's okay. I don't get it. It's one of those things. There are so many things that people do that, I talked before about, like scream metal. I've never had, I've had angsty periods, and I've had times where I was more blue and times where I was more content. I've never had anything that came close to that scream metal feeling. And so it's always, and punk and all that stuff, it's always felt kind of weird and performative to me. These gender reveal things also, I look at it and I feel like an alien looking at a totally different species doing something that, I guess I understand it kind of in concept that they do this thing, but it just makes no fucking sense to me. There are tons of things like that people do that just, I don't connect with in any way. And I don't think that it's because I am in any real way like neurodivergent or that I have some kind of anomaly in my perception. I think it's just like, maybe I do and it's just not diagnosed, but I don't think so. But I guess in the very general sense, maybe I'm a little different, but not in any specific sense that I'm aware of anyway. But there are so many things like this that I see people do, like dancing. Dancing has never made a fucking bit of sense to me. I understand, like, people love it. People feel like, oh, I'm moving to the music, and they just like let themselves go, and they're kind of really rolling with it. I get the thing where like you have a beat, and it makes you kind of move a little bit. But the actual like act of dancing, and especially, I spent a decent amount of time studying dancing, and there was someone who I was interested in who was super into dancing, and of course, me being me, that would motivate me. She's into dancing? Okay, I'm gonna spend, this is my kind of weird warped reasoning. I'm gonna spend, I think in that case, like over a year studying it. I took private lessons, which is a crazy thing too. Part of it was also that a lot of people in the physics department at the time were just super into dancing for whatever reason. But I took a lot of these things, and I'm okay at it. But I never felt like a thing that I really was driven to do. It never felt like a thing that, it wasn't even particularly enjoyable under any circumstance. And it was nice, kind of, with my instructor, and she was very good at it, and kind of, knew what to do, and I felt some level of competence. It was one of those cases where it's like the teacher is so good that when you're under their tutelage, you almost feel, you feel like you're elevated beyond your capacity. And it felt a little bit good, but even with that, and that was probably the best it felt, just like, eh. And dancing with people just is never, with people or on my own, I'm not like, like, gotta hear that music and just be driven to dance. It's not in my vocabulary as a human being. It's just not, it's not something that's there, And it's just, there are so many things like that for me, frankly. But, and there are a lot of things like, I kind of suspect, really strongly suspect, this is my interpretation of that. I don't think that it's that I am that anomalous, other than the fact that I think, or this is my interpretation, I think a lot of other people feel like I feel there, but they kind of roll with it because of social pressure. And for whatever reason, and maybe it's just that I'm stubborn, I don't know, but for whatever reason, that social pressure does not really, it's not to say that I'm not subject to social pressure at all, but like everybody else is acting a certain way, so I've got to feel that way. Doesn't drive me that much. I feel it a little bit with masking. Like I'm going out wearing a mask and nobody's wearing a mask anymore. It's like I just went to Costco tonight. Not a fucking person. Well, that's not true. There were maybe a half dozen people out of a couple orders of magnitude more, at least. There were a handful of people, who were wearing them, and I felt good about that when I saw them. I was like, yeah, we're the only idiots. Not a Freudian slip there at all, but we're the only ones who are not idiots out here, and you're just kind of like, yeah. And all these other fucking people not wearing a goddamn mask. And yeah, I understand that like right now community transmission isn't that high, although it's hard to tell because the CDC fucked with the metrics and they just fucked with the metrics again. Basically I mean, it's sick, frankly, that this stuff is engineered essentially to make things always look like they're okay. And it was already like it continually before. It was red across the nation. And so they changed the metrics from community transmission to sort of some measure of how things are in the hospitals. And so it took it from red to green, and it's like, oh yeah, things are all improved, despite not really changing very much of anything. And even with that though, things were starting to ramp up. So they've just rescaled it again to basically eliminate, I mean, it's not that it's impossible for it to look bad again, but it's pretty hard under the current rescaling. And it's hard for me to look at that and not interpret it as essentially statistical mass murder. It's essentially you're telling people that people who are counting on the CDC to be providing good, unbiased information that is the kind of information that you would use to make the sorts of decisions that could affect your life and the lives of people around you, which you would think the CDC would be like a trustworthy organization, but they're putting out bad data and discouraging. I mean, like the fucking testing is going way down, and all of the free tests are kind of evaporating. There are still insurance companies that are paying for some, but a lot of the ones, like people who don't have insurance, often who are the people who are working in very public-facing jobs and probably have the most exposure and probably need the tests more than, say, me, more than people like me need them. These are the people who now cannot get tests because they have shitty insurance or no insurance. And I mean, it's just one of these cases where I don't know, whether it's this or I want to call it climate change. Here's another thing where I'm kind of like tap dancing on the language, but whether it's climate change or global warming or the ongoing climate catastrophe is kind of what I lean toward that one a little bit, but it sounds, I don't know. I don't know what to say or what to call it that will get people to take it seriously, because it's one of these cases where I know a lot of people that take it seriously, but so many people who have positions of power don't. And, we're headed, it's like we're headed toward a cliff. I mean, just like the fucking pandemic shit, you're heading toward a cliff, except this one is much worse. And you have many opportunities to slow down, head over to a different direction. But instead of that, we're just gonna like barrel forward and do it. And it's just, it's depressing as fuck. And it's the most annoying thing, even more than the pandemic. I'm sure people will, well, assuming people are around in 20 years, people will look back and they'll be like, these fucking morons. Like, they had all this advanced technology. They had all these public health, well, I was going to say measures, but all this public health knowledge. So much stuff that we have, and just pissed it all away. Just ignored all that shit and did stupid shit for no real good reason, and killed millions and millions of people. It's like, who didn't have to die? And injured many, many more. Permanently injured many, many more, apparently. Like, it's so fucked. And that's like a tiny little, compared to the climate catastrophe, that's like nothing, right? And so we have this other thing, which is just, I mean, when you think about some of the things here, like Arizona, the state that I'm in, has enough sunshine falling on it that we could power the country, carbon free. And yet we're not even powering ourselves with that. Now, granted, you have to have storage. You probably need some things to deal with sudden loads. It takes some time to build up the capacity and all of this. But this is a state where every house should be covered in solar panels. Every parking lot should be covered in solar panels. We should have solar farms all over the place. The power distribution system here should be set up so that it really easily transfers power to and from houses, depending on the time and depending on how much power is needed or available. And we got so little of that. And if anything at all, the power companies here and a lot of the legislature and a lot of the people even are pushing against doing stuff like that, which is just, it's just so fucking dumb. You just can't, it's like, why? And people, assuming people make it, which I'm cautiously optimistic. Like, I don't think it's going to be great, but I'm cautiously optimistic people will make it. And now, of course, what does that mean by people will make it? It doesn't necessarily mean, like, there are certain places where they will very likely not be human habitable. And many places where we produce a lot of our food will no longer be viable as farmland. And, a lot of people will die. A lot of wars will be started over water and migration and all of these kinds of things which tend to cause wars. And especially, you have low-lying coastal countries where you have a lot of poor people. The sea levels rise, they get pushed in, and they get pushed into countries that probably aren't going to like it too much. Mass migrations of poor people into your country. A lot of countries don't care for that, and a lot of countries will go to war for it, or they'll commit atrocities, or, there's just a lot of bad stuff coming from that. And the thing about it is, like, and especially, I don't know, especially if you go back to like the 80s and Reagan ripped those solar panels off of the White House and steered us away from sustainability in a real way, in a way that has had lasting effects that are still felt today. If that would have not happened, if we would have set up the right way then, the temperature change that we're already experiencing would be significantly less. And the brunt of it coming forward would be much less. And instead, we're like, 1.5C, fuck that. We're gonna just hit the accelerator and, not even try. We're pretty much not even trying. It's hard to look at what we're doing and think we're making even the slightest effort. Fuck. So, I'm sorry, it's a thing that it really bothers me, and it's depressing as fuck. One thing, so I think I want to get back a little bit to the gender thing. And this is again, like, I'm in that class, learn the meaning of gender, the more accurate one. And that left an impression on me for many, many years. I mean, that impression is still felt. I've updated my view on it a little bit recently, because I used to think, if you have a test and it says sex, M/F, but then somebody would change it to gender, put me off. Now I think probably just, like, don't put either one there, but it put me off because I knew they were trying to get to biological sex and they were using this like euphemism for it. So it was like, why don't you just say the word you mean? But now either one of them kind of puts me off because I've gone a step further, which is basically maybe it's kind of weird actually. The people who were doing that were like crazy religious conservatives. There's that word again. They were religious, and there I just pointed my finger too, which in some cultures is not. I do try actually to point with not just one finger, but a whole hand full of fingers, which is one of those things that I do that probably does not even factor for most people. And I still did the one finger point just a minute ago, but yeah. Anyway, I worry about things that I probably, like are meaningless and don't, like most people don't even notice. Going back to this though, these conservative people, religious wackos, didn't want to say sex, so they put gender on. Now, which is kind of funny because now they wouldn't want to put gender on because they don't want to have people who are trans or non-binary put down a different gender. So now putting gender on, like gender might have actually been the right thing to put there. Now even that, they'd feel bad about. I'm not sure how I feel about it because it's one of those things that, it's just, I don't know. I think a lot about this, probably more than I should. But I kind of, it's interesting how much your brain, and when I say your here, I mean my, but really all of us, our brains organize the world and in a sort of structure that's based on the world that we live in. And the bins that we put things in, the categories that we lump things into, they're all trained, learned things. And it's really hard, honestly, like even when you're making an effort and even when you're kind of aware of this stuff, it's hard to escape that. Like it's funny also, like shit will leak in. Yesterday I was talking with somebody who works for me and we were talking about something somebody else said. And this person said something which was actually pretty, let's just say problematic. And just the framing. He said, I almost hesitate to repeat it here, but he said, too many chiefs, not enough Indians. And I'm saying it and I'm boxing it there, and I still feel weird saying it. But anyway, he said that. Not a thing that I would say, but I was talking with this person, and that came out of my mouth, or at least it started to, and I'm like, what the fuck? What am I saying here? That obviously I didn't mean these, and corrected it. But it's just, and that's just like a little thing like leaking in one time. And in contrast, like this gender stuff, your whole life, you're kind of taught to categorize people along this axis. And it's really, I feel like, well, I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert on this. Obviously, to call it even a continuum implies, well, I don't think it's just one axis. It's probably like a multi-dimensional sort of space. But probably people don't generally bend. Even people like I'm cis het male, basically, is if you want to put me in bends there. But do I fully, like, is there a lump there that is there a detent that just I click to? Or do I have, am I sort of someplace on a spectrum over here? Now, very different than other places on the spectrum, but I think everybody's kind of, almost necessarily. We're not all uniformly identical in these ways. There are a lot of people who just have a lot of, insecurities, let's say that. And those are also lumped in the same category as me, but I'm very different in that way. Not to say that I don't have insecurities, but I don't have the, like, I need a penis truck insecurity. I certainly don't have the if somebody is gay, then you have to like attack them because that's somehow a threat to your masculinity. I don't have that, even a little bit. And I mean, you look at this and it's just like, I don't know. The more I think about it, the more I kind of think it's. I mean, I guess it's probably very similar in a lot of ways to race. Another thing that I'm not an expert on, but if you look at race, and this is the same with gender, like most people will look at a person and they'll lump them into a category. They'll say, they're this gender, they'll say they're this race, just like lump, done. And they'll do that. It's not even like a conscious thing. It's not something that, it's just like they see that person 100 milliseconds later, their brain has already like lumped them in. And, or I might be exaggerating on the time, but very, very quickly, they're in a category. But if you start looking, like you start tearing apart that category and you start really looking at like, well, what does that category mean? It's very much in a weird way like the definition of life. Life is something you feel like you know. Like, is it alive or is it not alive? It's obvious, right? But then you start trying to come up with a definition and you realize like, okay, it's something that metabolizes. It's something that does this and does that and does this. And then it's like, well, okay, and reproduces and all of this. It's like, okay, you just described fire, which we're probably going to agree is not alive. Or maybe it is alive, I don't know. But, I think it's one of these things where you have the concept and you never really like dig into it. So you feel like you know that thing. But when you start teasing into it, you start investigating, it just falls apart. Race. If you look at genetic markers, it just falls apart. It doesn't really correlate to really pretty much anything, which is funny because to us, generally speaking, it's like, oh, this person is and you think that it means something that they're in that group. And in reality, it's just some arbitrary metrics happen to fall into some bin for you. And I think gender is a little bit like that. Which is not to say, obviously, and I certainly don't want to discount people's journey in discovering, what is their gender, and also like expressing that to the world. By all means, I'm in fact, I'm completely like, by all means, go and do that. But what I am saying is that maybe this is a concept that I'm not saying we should get away from it necessarily. Like there's something kind of there-ish, but largely, I mean, I'm not saying that everybody is kind of some degree of like non-binary or non-conforming, but to some extent, I mean, yeah. And again, there are people who are like hyper macho or hyper feminine. But for the most part, I think most people are kind of, you have some aspects that are this, you have some aspects that are that. You start really like teasing it apart, and it kind of falls apart a little bit, I think. And it's interesting because this is something where it's got to be like for people who are not the gender that they present to the world. Like if people lump you into a category and that category is not you, it's got to be maddening because it's something that's happening in every interaction, pretty much. You go out into the public, go to the grocery store, whatever, yes sir, yes ma'am. It's like people actually are doing that with good intentions. I mean, for the most part, they mean well when they're saying something like that. But it feels like a denial of how you identify, or just a denial of your being in some sense. I think that like the closest thing for me is if someone thought that I was a conservative, for example, I would feel like massively, massively offended by that. And even if they weren't like thinking about it beyond a superficial level, if they just like looked at me and lumped me into that bin, and obviously this is the air quotes conservative, I mean, I'm not either kind, but the air quotes one that the Republicans claim to be, you know, definitely not, and it would bother me. And obviously that's like, is it an assigned versus a achieved trait? It's difficult it's not a direct comparison, but that's the closest thing that I can think of, because people are not misgendering me, right? If, they pretty much identify me as I identify. Although, to be honest, I mean, like, it's one of those things, like, I can easily say that I don't care, and the fact that I say I don't care, you're like, oh, okay, because you are cishet male and you present as that, and that's what you identify as. It's easy not to care when everybody's just already automatically identifying you kind of as you identify. I really like, I don't know. It's not that I don't have, it's definitely not that I am, I would say, non-binary or anything like that, but I also just don't really, like, my masculinity is not something that I feel defines and identifies me that much, and I just don't care. Like, it's not, it doesn't feel, it's never felt like really the group that I identify with. I think, like, maybe this is just, I was raised by a single mother. I had a sister, spent a lot of time with women. I've pretty much always had more friends who are women than men, and not just that, but I, like, in terms of hanging out with people, much rather, generally speaking, hang out with women. Other than there are certain things that are a little bit more annoying, but the kinds of things that I just feel a little skewed in terms, or in that respect. But I just don't, I don't know. It just kind of does not, like, I don't even know how to explain it without sounding like, I don't want to say, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying, like, I don't see race, I don't see gender. Obviously I do. But what I'm saying is I don't really strongly identify myself in that regard. And I kind of feel like, I don't know, would we be better off if most people, like, maybe you think about it a little bit, but it's not like I mean, the way that it is now, somebody sees you and it's like the primary identifying characteristic, the first bin that they segment you in is this gender thing. Maybe it should be, even if it's there, maybe it should be like after several other things. But I don't know. It's hard to say, because it's like also, it's tied up in a little bit of human nature, but a lot of the evolution of culture that's taken us here, and the sort of particularities of the weaving path of how history has gone, which has a lot of things mixed up in it. And so we're here, I mean, like, what kind of clothing do I wear? Even though, or this is one that, and I don't mean this in the gendered sense, but just in terms of, like, fashion, I'm very annoyed by the fact that I cannot buy shorts that go below my knees. It's, maybe it's just me being dated, and I do think there's some time, this is just my experience as well, but I feel like there's a certain, like, period of time, I don't know if it's in your mental development or what, but for me, there's a little area with a few years, and the way my clothes were then, and the way that a lot of things were then, the music of the era, it just seems, I'm not saying it's like better than everything else, although the short thing I think is, that one I like better, but it just kind of like feels more homey. to me, you know? The sort of 90s hip hop was that era. It's like, I don't know why, but and it's not that I don't like a lot of music from long before or since, but it just sort of clicks more for me. The shorts now that are like, and I've been finding slightly longer shorts, but the ones that I get for the most part are way up above my knees, and I just feel like it's kind of silly. It's not that I'm super modest or something, but I feel like exposed. I don't feel comfortable. I also like, because they're so pulled up. If I put shit in my pockets, which is one of the reasons I have shorts, because I want big pockets, it's like not in a good place. It's kind of hanging into my legs, if that makes sense. And I'd rather it be a little bit more out of the way, and it just bothers me. I don't even know, going off on some weird tangent of a tangent. It's weird. When I was thinking about this episode, I thought that I had something to say. I probably don't, other than just, I certainly am not somebody who's in a position to even really have an opinion on this stuff, frankly. So, massive grain of salt with my stuff. But it's also, it's just like, I guess the interesting thing to me is just how my perception of that has changed over time. And I don't know, will it stay that way? Is it going to move again? I don't know. But for now, I just, I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is there. I definitely feel like, I mean, the thing is also, there's the right answer for some period in the far future where hopefully we're way past the stupidity that we have now. And then there's the right answer for now. Like the right answer for now is, of course, or at least I think, if you're being, if you identify in a certain way and people are misgendering you and they're misidentifying you, then the right answer seems to be like, yeah, you got to come out. And well, I mean, you don't have to come out, but you need to have some kind of means of telling the world who you are, because the world is going to tell you who they think you are. And that misalignment is just very frustrating. It's very like, you don't feel seen, and you feel just mislabeled. I know it's kind of a sad thing, but you want to be identified as what you are, or what you see yourself, how you perceive yourself. You want alignment there. And I feel like at some point, now maybe in the future we never get there, but I would love to be at a point in the future where it's like, you don't even think about pronouns. It's just they, them, or the equivalent for everybody, because people don't think along those lines. It's another question, actually. Like, race as a concept is relatively recent. People obviously looked at skin color as a parameter of people, but like the identifying of people in terms of races, it's not something that was there many thousands of years ago. It's more like a more recent, like hundreds of years kind of concept, it seems. And especially like the Atlantic slave trade era and all of this kind of stuff. It's all kind of intermeshed, and there are many threads there, but that seems to be something that kind of was created, and it'd be nice to somehow find a way to unburden ourselves of that and not see ourselves in that way. And I'm not saying it's not just that I'm trying to tiptoe precariously here, because I definitely don't want to say like we shouldn't see race. Obviously we should see people in all of their depths and all of the aspects that are actually there. But I'm also trying to say it'd be nice if that wasn't like the thing that we're like, you see somebody and you're like, okay, that is a black dude, that is a white dude. And it's just like those two bits of information identify that person in a very real way for a lot of people. And it'd be nice if those were like attributes that they happen to have. They're way down the list, you know. They're not really like at the fore. Um, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just being silly there. I definitely think. I mean, the thing you have to consider is we're nowhere near that, obviously, and so it's one of these things also where like the people who try to insist that we're there, and they're like, oh, I don't see race or some bullshit like this. That person either full of shit or deluding themselves because, obviously they live in our culture. And also, like, even imagine if you didn't. The problem is, it's a weird thing because, and again, I'm way outside of my domain of expertise here, but all of the stuff I said about race being kind of like an artificial construct is true, but, and this is a big thing, because we see it in that way, because we've used that construct, our society is stratified along that axis. So it may not be a real thing in the biological sense or in these other senses. Gender and sex may be very complicated, but it doesn't matter to some extent because we have this weird consensus that kind of lumps people in these ways. And if that consensus decides you're female, you're getting paid 70 cents on the dollar, you're getting maimed, you're getting a bunch of other stuff that you probably don't like. And if that consensus says that you're black, then in our culture, you're much more likely. I mean, it's an interesting thing when you look at any kind of measure, like drugs. Cannabis is a really common drug that is used pretty much, interestingly enough, pretty much uniformly across many demographics. So if you slice by race or if you slice by socioeconomic status, the use is pretty level. But if you look at how much people go to prison for it, how many people get arrested for it, if you're black or you're brown, or if you're poor, and especially, like you're even doubly fucked if you're both, or some combination thereof, you're much, much more likely to get arrested, to get convicted, to go to prison, to be disenfranchised, than if you're white. And if you're rich, like the difference is, it's not like in the noise, it's massive, massive difference. And that is, again, like you're saying, like, okay, like I'm saying, this categorization is not real in some sense, but because our society has chosen to decide that it is, if you you project across that axis, you see massive, massive disparities. You see, like, if you're living in a school district that's dominated by one group or the other, that defines more than many other things the quality of the education that you're going to get. It defines so much about your life, and it's frustrating. Like, because I'm simultaneously like trying to talk about like where we are, where I wish we would get, or hope one day maybe we would get. But I think the problem comes when people ignore all this stuff and try to pretend that we're in this potentially far future, not even necessarily far future, but sort of, it would be, or it seems like it would be better if this was just not a factor or not like a major thing that we are concerned with. But that's like hypothetical. It's not like the reality of the situation. And if you ignore that reality, then you're actually actively causing harm. So it's problematic. I don't know that any of that necessarily means anything, but and I'm sure it's probably offensive to some people, just like the crazy thing. The thing actually about just to jump back to that one, someone recently, and this is someone who I really like and respect, but somebody said, a mutual friend of both of ours said something and called something dumb. And then this person who is, again, mutual friend, said, you shouldn't say dumb because it's ableist. And I'm like, I don't know. It's one of these things because it's like, on one hand, yeah, I see, you read about the history of what this word means, where it comes from, and all this kind of stuff, and you can't deny, yeah, not great. It's definitely the original meaning, and I mean, yeah, like going back to the construction of words like idiot and moron, these kinds of things, they're not good. They're really, really fucked up, actually. And so it's frustrating because there are many times when you might want to use those words to describe something, and then you think at the same time, like you want to say this is idiotic, but do you mean that this is, something with this sort of IQ test, eugenics history, or do you mean it's just silly, or just absurd, or whatever? You probably mean the latter, I would hope. And so, I don't know, I wish that you could like take those words and just decouple them from the history, because it would be nice to use certain words like that, and yet I understand people being bothered by it, and I want to respect that too. And so I feel very torn, because part of me wants to use some of these words. Part of me wants to not even think that they're problematic. And then part of me also hears people saying, like, don't say dumb. And it's not just that somebody's saying that, but they actually like give you a link, and then you look into that and you read about it. And also, I mean, you do know, even before reading the link, it's like, well, people have the deaf, dumb, and blind, and by dumb there, they mean, like, blind is another one that is very problematic. It's very easy to say somebody's blind to X, and that's obviously, well, now, do you mean it in the way that is negative? Probably not, but, and you do mean like they cannot see something, but, and then in the same context, dumb there meant mute, essentially. And, so obviously you can sort of see why that would be problematic. And you just kind of sit there and you go like, I don't know what you feel like you're being pulled in all these different directions. And also that you don't mean it in a negative way, but people are offended by it. And so it's like, there are certain things like, fuck, I'm probably never gonna, I understand people are offended by the word fuck. I don't really care. I don't give a fuck that you're offended by the word fuck. I've made my peace with that word. Now, maybe one day I will change my mind, but I'd really doubt it. But some of these words, especially like dumb, idiot, moron, all of these kinds of things, I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm torn, because there are good uses for them. And they're not just the natural word that like comes up to the fore of my mind when I want to say it. It's like, that's the word that comes to me. It's also kind of feels descriptive for what I'm trying to say, although it's an interesting thing. Like, am I thinking in those terms because I have that word? If I didn't have that word, would I be thinking of it in a different way? I mean, it's like, I'm totally, once again, the word escaping me. It's the term for linguistics, or the linguistics term where words are defining how you think. And I want to say it's like Wolf something, and it's just not there. It's frustrating. I don't know. Is it a normal thing that I'm just focusing on now and I'm noticing it more? Is it sleep deprivation? Is it age? Is it that I'm just out of practice? I don't know what it is. It concerns me a little bit. I don't think it's like that serious, but it's definitely like a thing that I'm aware of. And although, am I aware of it because I'm thinking about it? It's just like confirmation bias, or is it really there? I don't know. Anyway, um, is it that I have these words so I think along those lines, or is it that that's just like a natural axis to think about, and so I happen to have a word that happens to align pretty well with it? I just don't know. Um, it's an interesting thing to me, but the gender thing, I'm very curious about, and I don't have a good I don't have a good grasp really on how will I see that in like 5 or 10 years versus how I see it now versus how I saw it in the past. It's one of those. There are some words that have been much more. I'm not saying that they're frozen, but the the idea that I had for hello has been pretty much my whole life. Once I figured out what hello meant, it's been like locked in there. It hasn't been that dynamic. It hasn't changed that much. My concept of gender, and not just the meaning of the word, but also the meaning of the concept, has been very fluid. No pun intended. Um, it's been just dynamically changing over time. And I guess, I don't know, this is one of those things that you could just not think about and just kind of roll with whatever seems natural. That seems like the wrong answer. Um, you could just automatically try to jump to whatever you think other people want. Maybe that's better, maybe it's not. I don't think so. I think it's important to think about things, and probably also, at the very least, like when you're using concepts or when you're trying to figure out which axis to align what you're talking about to, I think it's important to kind of think about how is that going to be taken? How do you mean it? How do you like what is the right way to cut what you're talking about? And I don't know. It's not that you should just not examine things versus examine them. I think generally speaking, examine them. But it's also like you have to consider, um, the concepts in your mind are dynamic. The concepts that other people have are dynamic. Society changes, you change, and yeah, if you kept using the same vocabulary in the same way, um, through the course of your life, unless your life is extremely short, it's going to mean different stuff at some point in the future, and you should probably. I guess there are two things. One, you should adapt, and two, as because you're part of the participant that's defining how these things go. And again, not that I have, you know, of the people who are, I don't want to say like allowed to do this, but of the people who kind of should be allowed to do this, I am at the bottom of the fucking list. A lot of people have opinions that take priority over mine on a lot of these things. Um, but I do think you should think about it, and especially like if you're, I don't know, if you're using, obviously you're speaking to people in life probably. You should probably consider what you're saying. One of the things, I mean, this is jumping topics a tiny bit, but sort of on the same lines. Um, a long time ago, I taught my friend Gil Kweidze, which is chopsticks, and basically, or he was going to Chinese restaurants and saying Kweidze, and then his daughter pointed out, you're just kind of like barking chopsticks at them. Maybe you should be asking, could I have chopsticks? And it's kind of funny because it's like, you're trying to be accommodating, but you're doing it in a way that's not very thoughtful. And you don't, it's not, obviously, it's not that you didn't mean to not be thoughtful, but you were kind of blind to it. And then, you see, I didn't mean to use that, but it's still, it's frustrating. Even though I'm trying not to do it, it's like there. It's like, it's an active, constant thing. And that's one that I actually try to avoid, and yet it's so natural in that case. You're unable, and then it's one of the problems with that is I want to come up with an alternative, and I'm locked on that concept of like not being able to see it, which means blind. But there's probably a better way to think about that. You're, you know, I don't know. I'm sure there is. It's not coming to me now. But you don't realize that you're being offensive, or that you're being, you know, maybe not necessarily offensive, but not as diplomatic or as caring or thoughtful as you could be. And you didn't mean to, and you, in this case, even are trying, and yet you're kind of screwing it up. It's good to think about that, and especially like when somebody points it out. At least this is my thinking. It's good to listen to them, and not necessarily. I mean, there are two aspects here. One, and this is a frustrating thing that I do, but somebody points something out to me, I don't dismiss it out of hand, but I think about it, and I kind of decide for myself, like, how do I feel about what I said or what I'm doing or whatever it is. And there are times, like fuck, where I'm like, I understand, you know, I understand that people are bothered by it. I understand that if I didn't use it, people would be less bothered. I understand that, you know, I'm trying to make people feel more, my impulse genuinely is to try to make people feel accommodated and more comfortable. And yet I've kind of decided, like, despite all those things, I don't really care in that case. I feel okay dropping some fucks. You know. But then sometimes I decide, like, oh shit, I shouldn't be doing that. I shouldn't be, you know, saying it this way. I should be thinking about this in this other way. And I think that's, I don't know. At the very least, like, I think it's important to reflect on things. And if you do decide to go one way or the other, or someplace in between, it should be based on reflection and not just kind of some knee-jerk response. Like, one of the things that, just related to gender, but I've for the longest time had in my bio on Twitter, and as soon as it was available, LinkedIn and Instagram, he/they. And I have it also in my Zoom, and it's just there. Doesn't mean anything. It's just there. Primarily, it's there, honestly, to make people feel accommodated and less kind of like singled out. Because you don't want to be the person. I mean, maybe some people do, but if someone's like me, they don't want to be the one person who's like kind of hanging out there, saying, you know, my pronouns are this, and nobody else is doing it. So this was a thing I reflected on, and I had some people give me opinions on, and so I kind of landed on doing this. You really, in order to be accommodating, I think, want to do that. It should be, it's one of these things, like, given that we are not in this, like, maybe potential future where, like, where we are, and people do think in gendered terms, maybe it's good to kind of make it normalized to say, like, what your pronouns are. And so I put them there. And yet there are some of these idiots on fucking Twitter who see that, and as though it was some kind of a massive win or meant something, they're like, pronouns in bio, or better yet, the funniest one is, you have pronouns, as though they don't have pronouns. Yeah, it's just fucking, like, weird as fuck. Like, I think, I generally think like people like this just don't reflect. I don't think that they're necessarily bad people. I think they just don't realize um, what they're doing, or at least I like to think that. But there are so many people who just have like no introspection or examination, and they just kind of go with the crowd and do the things that everybody else is doing without realizing sometimes that they're, and I want to say dumb, but it's just not intelligent or thoughtful or careful way to do things. It's not a good way to be, really. I do think that I assign value to that. Like I think it's not good. It's not like whether you're doing it on purpose. This is a thing. I don't think you're responsible for harm that you cause that's not intentional to some extent. But the question is like, are you responsible for harm that you unintentionally caused that you could have known about versus like you're doing something, you know, if I like wave my hand and because of that, through some weird fluid dynamics butterfly effect, a hurricane comes at some island and, you know, or a typhoon in the South Pacific and has some massive deleterious effect that wouldn't have happened had I not done it. You can't really, there's no way you could possibly have any understanding of that causation. But if you do something where, I mean, there's a big spectrum here. If you do something where you know you do X, Y will happen reliably. You point a gun at somebody, you pull the trigger, clearly you're responsible. There's a lot of area in between though where you're kind of like, well, there are things that you could have theoretically known about, but you just weren't exposed to them, or you never thought about them and you never had somebody point them out to you. And then there are things where if you would have just thought about it, you would have realized the consequences of what you did. And I think in terms of morality, it's not a binary thing, but like it's definitely better, generally speaking, to try to be thoughtful than to not. Obviously, you don't want to be like paralyzed by it and unable to live your life because everything has consequences and you're trying to figure out what are the consequences of every action that you take, and then you end up not being able to do anything. Paralyzed. There's an interesting one also. Is that ableist to say you're paralyzed? You don't want to be paralyzed. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I do feel like there's a certain point where if you're going to go too far down that path, you could probably invalidate like almost all of our vocabulary because everything is a little bit problematic if you examine it enough. And then you sort of think, well, okay, you're not going to wipe out almost all language. And you're also probably not going to use all the language. So you have to kind of figure out where is the right place to be. And I think it's something you have to kind of constantly contemplate. You don't want to, well, you don't have to, but if you want to be a good person, you should be thinking about that. I think that's actually where I'm landing here. It's the act of at least trying to make the effort, trying to understand the consequences of the stuff that you're doing, and then moving yourself in a direction. Yeah, I often say being amoral is inevitably immoral. Amorality is inevitably immorality. Unethicality is inevitably unethical. Because if you don't have any bias, if you don't have a bias there, you're not trying to go toward the being more moral and you're not trying to go toward being more ethical, then obviously you're just going to have a distribution, and intrinsically and inevitably, like necessarily, you're going to have some unethical and immoral stuff that you do just because there's no bias. And it's not that you're going to you know, I mean, if you start thinking like all of the things you do and all the consequences that you have that they have, um, you know, if you walk around and you don't see little either microbes or tiny insects, and then you step on them, you've killed them. Is that how bad is that? And then if you're like aware that there's stuff everywhere, then are you but there's the paralyzed again. Are you frozen? Are you unable to make moves? Or do you just ignore that stuff? I try, for what it's worth, I try not to step on ants or other insects. I kind of, when I'm walking, kind of have my head cocked down a little bit. I do that knowing that there's plenty of stuff that I'm not seeing that I'm probably stepping on. And, you know, I've kind of made my peace with that, although ending the lives of microscopic organisms because you're carelessly stepping on them, or maybe not, because, you know, at those levels, even the flat parts of your shoes have texture and depth, so you're stepping on them and maybe you're not crushing them and maybe you are. It's just chance. But I don't know. I'd say try for this kind of like, it's not a very insightful thing, but, you know, try, like try to make things better. Try to be a little bit of a better person. It seems like a no-brainer to me. And especially also, you know, you can't fix everything that you're doing. You can't make yourself harmless, short of, you know, I mean, in fact, I was going to say short of no longer existing, but if you no longer exist, all the people that care about you are sad, so you've caused harm even doing that. So there's no real solution there. And given that you do exist, I mean, to me, it's best to just try to make things better for other people and other, you know, other beings, try to leave things a little bit better than you found them. Try not to screw things up terribly, and try to be accommodating, which I don't know, I see some of these people and you just are like, I wish I assume that they have a kind of miserable existence, honestly. And I feel kind of bad for the people who are like, oh, haha, pronouns in bio. Just as like one example. But, you know, the people that are like super either bigoted or thoughtless or whatever. I mean, to me, and I want to be clear, I'm not making any excuses for them. And I'm not saying that it's okay what they're doing. But I think there's a layer of it also, which is just like, it's sad. You know, this is a person who doesn't know any better, hopefully doesn't know any better. I mean, it's depressing if they're doing it, realizing like all of the depth and like reasoning behind it, and they're still like, haha, yeah. That to me is, I mean, in terms of like just being unethical versus being extremely and deliberately unethical or immoral, it's a difference. It matters. It's an interesting, you can go into whole layers of philosophy over, is it the consequences or the intentions? I don't know that either one of those is adequate at all. And I mean, another domain that I'm summarily not qualified to talk about is philosophy. I have thoughts about it, but you know, the amount that I know is just like the barest scratching of the surface, and I can have opinions on it, but yeah, I would not claim to be any sort of an expert. Anyway, with that, I am super tired, and I still need to take another walk because I have a little bit of a motor, and I need to take a walk sometimes. And it's already 9:45, so 21:46 rather. With that, thank you for listening. I hope none of this was too offensive. Yeah, it was not really well considered or fleshed out, and it was more like stream of consciousness, which is my standard style. So please understand and take it in that sense. And if I did say something to offend, please factor that in. With that, though, thanks, and until next time, it's IGN.